Good morning, everyone. Bom dia, pessoal. My name is Guilherme, and I'm a PhD student at the São Paulo State University. Here I'm discussing Nina LaCour's We Are Okay. William Banks states that we should read LGBTQ young adult literature emphatically and critically. Once, then I quote, having the texts available is not enough, particularly when we think about the stakes. Based on this assumption, this presentation seeks to present a possibility of reading We Are Okay, a 2017 novel written by Nina LaCour that won the Michael Prince Award in 2018 for Best Book Written for Teens. Currently, in the United States alone, there are almost 70 children's literature awards. This number becomes even more surprising when compared to the number of awards and titles that celebrate YA literature. Also taking into account only the United States, I found 11 awards. Of these, 4 are awarded by the Young Adult Library Services Association, YALSA, a division of the American Library Association, whose objective is, I quote, to support library staff in alleviating the challenges teens face and in putting all teens, especially those with the greater needs, on the path to successful and fulfilling lives. Discussing and thinking about the LGBTQ themed narratives involve different ideas and perspectives. Michael Cart defines YA novels in general as, I quote, the quintessential literature of the outsider. Once it shows the life-saving necessity of seeing one's own face reflected in the pages of a good book, and the corollary comfort that derives from the knowledge that one is not alone. In agreement with Corinne Wickens, I believe that LGBTQ-themed narratives specifically, I quote, are exceptionally important given the heteronormative structures in place to monitor and control sexual and gender identities and expressions. In an interview to the Salt Lake City Weekly, Brooke Young, a member of the Best Fiction for Young Adults Committee, stated that the Michael Prince Award was created as a counterpoint to the Newbery Medal. For this reason, the award is given to the book that best demonstrates excellence in YA literature. But, after all, what is meant by excellence? Young says that excellent books are, I quote, books that are well plotted and contain believable emotions. It's really hard for some writers to show emotions and to have characters feel things. The impressionism of this answer leads us to believe that there is no consensus among the members of the committee on what is meant by excellence in YA fiction. On the other hand, what is an excellent LGBTQ YA novel? Katie Lewis mentions that, I quote, in recent years, there has been an influx in the recognition of an interaction with YA literature that portrays LGBTQ characters. The general consensus of these discussions of representation in YA novels is that we are being offered much more realistic and positive representations of LGBTQ teens than in the past decades. Michael Waters mentions that, I quote, the amount of YA books featuring queer characters has grown from roughly 1 per year in the 70s to 7 per year in the 90s to upwards of 50 per year more recently. But we must also consider, in accordance to Lewis, that, I quote again, there may be room for improvement when it comes to overall visibility and the ways in which these stories are framed as hopeful tales of coming to terms with identity, or as scare tactics meant to guide vulnerable readers back into a safe lifestyle of heterosexuality. And what's We Are Okay perspective on sexuality? In We Are Okay, Marine, the protagonist and the narrator, runs away from San Francisco, California, and goes to New York weeks before the other freshmen arrive. She is now an undergraduate student and arrives early at the campus dormitory because she can't deal with her grandfather's recent suicide. She started living with him after her mother's death when she was just 3 years old. Even years after the loss of her mother, she still sought for some connection with the maternal figure. The grief of her grandfather for the death of his daughter culminates in the development of a mental illness, which supposedly leads to suicide. This character created a kind of museum with his daughter's belongings, which the protagonist only has access to after his death. The pain is so intense that she leaves for New York only with her credit card, cell phone, and documents, putting herself in a state of mental and spatial isolation from herself and from those who were part of her daily life. This includes the exclusion of Mabel, her best friend with whom she had started a romantic relationship. She is alone in the world, or at least she thinks that way. Mabel doesn't give up on her and visits Marine in New York, bringing back memories and making an interesting proposal. She asks Marine to live with her and her parents, Anna and Javier. The protagonist ends up accepting this proposition, despite being afraid of not being able to love anybody else in her life. She's alone in the building when Mabel arrives. There's a symmetry between the names Marine and Mabel. The protagonist herself explains it to us. I quote, an M followed by a vowel, then a consonant, then a vowel, then a consonant. We thought it was important. We thought it must have meant something. Like a similar feeling must have passed through our mothers as they named us. Like destiny was at work already. We may have been in different countries, but it was only a matter of time before we would collide into each other. Mabel goes to New York and spends 3 days with Marine. Despite the physical and emotional distance that the protagonist created between herself and her recent past, which includes her detachment from Mabel, Marine begins to realize that it is impossible to get rid of her own past and of who she is. Mabel has sent her a variety of text messages since she left, but has been completely ignored. There's a whole preparation for the arrival of this friend in New York. The protagonist even rehearses a smile in the mirror and begins to create a different atmosphere for the room she shares with Hannah. For that, she needs photos of herself and of celebrities, souvenirs, and proof of internal jokes. Marine tries to forge all this, but remembers that Mabel, and I quote, knows me better than anyone else in the world. At a certain point in the novel, Mabel says that she became interested in the protagonist since she said something smart in a literature class. Marine was the exact kind of person Mabel wanted to meet. Furthermore, throughout the novel, Marine starts to share her anxieties with her friend, breaking the isolation in which she placed herself. Despite the sexual tension orchestrated by Lacour between the characters throughout the novel, it is not explicitly stated that Marine and Mabel were in love with each other until two-thirds of the novel. The protagonist does not answer her friend's messages. She decides to move on with her life and, as the protagonist, does not answer Mabel's messages. Mabel decides to move on with her life and, in college, meets Jacob, who attends literature classes with her and becomes her boyfriend. But it is very clear she still has feelings for Marine. At the end of the novel, Mabel tells her friend that she has nothing serious with him, even though she said she loved him in a telephone conversation. Marine initially does not know if she still loves her, but thinks she looks beautiful. Then, in a moment of anguish, when she tells her friend what she found out about her grandfather, she confesses to herself that she loves her, but can't go back in time. Although the two had already trained to kiss, the real kiss happened at dawn on the beach, while the two drank whiskey. I quote, "The cold air against my skin was nothing compared to the warmth of her breath," recalls the character, while briefly describing the sexual relationship they had. They already loved each other and become even closer. They both believe they would never love someone else. The sympathetic grandfather says that there are different types of love, and I quote, "Sometimes two people have a deep connection. It makes a romance seem trivial. To a child to a child's coming out as LGBTQ increases the significance of close peer relationships. Indeed, in these YA novels, authors tend to characterize these reactions and relationships much more favorably," says Wickens. In this sense, the author continues, and I quote, "Friendships among LGBTQ individuals are underscored as means to decrease social isolation and alienation and to gain an understanding of broader queer communities." Heterosexual friends and allies also figure prominently in these texts. Esther Saxey argues that, and I quote, "Discourses of sexual identity help to create what they purport to describe. Thus, the coming out story, which purports to describe a pre-existing sexual identity, is simultaneously contributing to the cultural construction of this identity." How does We Are Okay constructs the homosexual identity? Although Hannah, Maureen's roommate, helps her to get through the isolation process, her grandfather is sympathetic towards her sexuality, and Mabel is more than a friend, a lover Maureen has to give up in order to be a part of a heterosexual family. At the end of the novel, Maureen confesses that she was afraid of her own loneliness. Throughout her journey, she tries to punish herself through the mental and physical and spatial isolation she puts herself into by leaving San Francisco behind and not talking about her life with her new college friends. She tries not to respond to the stimuli around her by staying in small spaces. Her bed, her bedroom, in an accommodation at a university whose students are on vacation. Initially, in the hotel room, and so on. She is alone until Mabel arrives. She loved Mabel and she has to give up this feeling twice by leaving San Francisco and all of what it meant, and by becoming her sister, accepting Mabel's mother as her own. Mabel wants to know if Maureen is interested in someone new. The protagonist herself thinks she wants to have a positive answer so they can both move on. Maureen reflects, and I quote again, "To think of a new girl is pretty, and not in a way that lots of people in the world are pretty, but pretty in a way that might mean something to me. To look into Mabel's dark eyes, try not to stare at her pink mouth or her long hair and say that. To think that a girl who is practically a stranger could be the next person I love. To think she might take Mabel's place." Maureen herself thinks that it sounds like another loss. Thus, on the one hand, We Are Okay shows the importance of friends and self-reflection in times of overcoming a serious loss. On the other hand, it becomes moralizing by reinforcing the heteronormativity that governs our social system. In We Are Okay, Maureen's possibility of moving forwards involves the fact that she is now part of a traditional family, and as she has always wished. So the character must give up the sexual tension that involved her entire relationship with Mabel throughout the novel. In her study of sexual minorities in contemporary realistic fiction between 2000 and 2005, Korean Weekends shows that, and I quote, the depictions of heteronormativity, homophobia, and institutions of schooling tend to be authoritative networks of power that more often than not serve to oppress LGBTQ characters rather than advocate on their behalf. We Are Okay succumbs to the idea of heteronormativity. Marine giving up on her love for Mabel and accepting Mabel's mother, Anna, as her own is the consolidation of her dream of living in heteronormativity. I always wanted to be your mother, this character says. Gilmar Nogueira explains that, and I quote, the term heteronormativity was coined in 1991 by Michael Warner. The concept seeks to account for a new social order, that is, if before that order required everyone to be heterosexual, today the sexual order requires that everyone, heterosexuals, homosexuals, and other individuals organize their lives according to the supposedly coherent model of heterosexuality. He continues, in heteronormativity, all subjects must organize their lives according to the heterosexual model, whether this person is heterosexual or not. With this, we understand that heterosexuality is not just a sexual orientation, but a political model that organizes people's lives. Thus, in heteronormativity, LGBTQ people are coherent only if they identify with heterosexuality as a model, maintaining what Nogueira calls gender linearity. Men must behave manly, for instance. To organize their lives according to the model of heterosexuality, he affirms, and I quote, homosexuals must do everything that a heterosexual person does. An example is the marriage ritual, which is a social exigency within acceptable parameters, and the adoption of children as a simulacrum of reproductive sexuality. The researcher explains that, and I quote again, it does not mean that those who wish to marry and have children do so because of heteronormativity, but that this prescription will mark those who do not wish to ascend to the supposed bound model. In We Are Okay, Marine starts to understand her sexuality and is afraid of never loving anybody else but Mabel. But at the same time, her journey in search for herself culminates in the acceptance of heteronormativity. So we can classify it as a dysphoric journey, despite her coming out. Her decision configures the book as a very traditional text. If Yelsa's objective is to lead teenagers towards fulfilling lives, and if the Michael Prince Award wants excellent books that may connect the reader with the characters, We Are Okay demonstrates that, at least in which concerns LGBTQ teenagers, the ideology behind it seems to be towards the maintenance of heteronormative values. Thank you.